Hi guys, so today I am hiking not too far out on the Adobe Jack Trail, which is sort of by this well-known restaurant called Mariposa next to 89A. And it's a really beautiful trail. You get awesome views of what some people call the morning glory spires. And then there's also an interesting angle of Coffee Pot Rock and Mount Wilson, kind of that whole feature with Sail Rock on the other side. So yeah, working on a 9x12 horizontal format. And today I'm going to be getting into a unified palette a bit more. The theme for this painting session is how do I mix my red rock formula? And honestly, it changes every time, but it's basically a mixture of all the primaries, red, yellow, blue. Sometimes has more of the yellow to create like an orangey red rock, or sometimes more of the red to give it more of that red rock feeling. I add more blue when it's further back in the distance, but only a tiny bit usually, unless it's super like atmospheric. So we'll go over what today's formula is and how I kind of mixed the colors off of that mother color. And that really harmonizes the palette. It's fun to kind of explore the different ways that you can communicate the scenery through different pigments and mixtures of them. I use a pretty limited palette, though I do have a warm and a cool of each, so I can kind of push some exciting color relationships. And I hope you enjoy this video. Thanks so much for watching. So this is the view of inspiration for the painting, and the whole piece was painted using this flat number 8 Princeton Aspen brush. My palette is titanium white, cad lemon, yellow, cad yellow medium, alizarin crimson, cad red medium, cad red light, ultramarine blue, and cerulean blue hue. This is the 9x12 panel, horizontally formatted, and just taking my warm yellow with some alizarin crimson and then putting that down really thin, kind of creating a wash. There's this like chunk of blue paint that got on the palette, but that'll eventually be covered up, so not going to worry about it too much. I'm just getting the feel for the composition by placing some lines here and trying to keep it really loose and kind of intuitive. Drawing is like fundamental in painting. So I don't do a ton of drawing in my sketchbook, though I have been more lately. But literally every time I start an oil painting, I am drawing this sketch with my brush and I am refining the drawing throughout the entire process. So, you know, having a sense of proportion, perspective, all that is really key to having a painting read, even if it's like super painterly and loose. There's always those foundational lines that kind of need to be there. And it helps you just get into the painting when you know where everything is going to be placed. So I've got my major shapes here. I've got that morning glory spire with those sandstone cliffs behind it. Got my horizon line in there, and then kind of like that sharp diagonal line where there's a foreground hill and some trees. There are many hills leading up to this feature, and so these are really more distant because of the placement of the red rock features. They're quite large, so you know, it's all going to be kind of a little bit what's pushed back is being pulled forward. And this is, what I would say is a pretty dynamic composition. You've got a variety of shapes and, not too many repetitive shapes. The canvas isn't split into thirds or split in half. So these are all the things that I'm checking when I'm designing the scene, and it's amazing, what you notice as the painting evolves with certain composition decisions that you didn't need to make, or maybe that would have helped. But this feels like a pretty good plan to start with, and I'm going right into my shadows because those are vanishing pretty quickly, and so I want to get them in first. And the light is going to stay pretty consistent on those foreground hills and in the sky. So what matters right now is just getting in these blocks of shadow, because that is what creates the form and the contrast in the scene. So I will show you my color mixtures in just a minute here, but essentially my mother color is this red rock formula, which is alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow medium, and a dab of ultramarine blue. So because I use both yellow and red to create that sandstone color, sometimes leaning more on the red side or more on the yellow side, adding blue is a complement of orange, which is what those two colors make. So I'm attempting to modify it through its complement, and that way it looks more naturalistic, and it leads you into thinking that it's more of that kind of brownish red rock rather than, something that doesn't feel like a natural sandstone color. So you're kind of adding a little bit of all three of those primaries in there to create that. And I'll show you really quick how I mixed that formula and how I mixed those distant greens and that violet too. So that's the alizarin crimson and the ultramarine blue, and adding a little bit of the yellow. Because these red rocks are distant, I'm focusing more on the violet shade of it. So dominant alizarin crimson with ultramarine blue, and then adding the cad yellow medium. And as the shades get lighter, so I've got a middle value now and a light value, I'm adding more alizarin, more of that cad yellow medium, and then white towards that that highlight or that lighter shade. This is basically the formula for the red rocks in this painting. All of the other mixtures will kind of come from this palette. So every color is going to have some amount of alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow medium. So now I'm trying to kind of look at what those distant greens might be. So this is going to be yellow and blue dominant, but a little bit more on the blue side. And by adding the red to the green mixture, I'm modifying it and pushing it back. So it's more of like a grayish green. Can even add a little bit more yellow into that highlight. But anyway, so you can see how I've mixed that more distant green that's kind of popping into light against the shadowed red rock. Next to it is going to be more of just like that violet hillside that's in the back with basically like the ultramarine blue and the alizarin crimson plus white, a little tiny touch of the cad yellow medium. Now I'm doing these sandstone cliffs that are behind, and they are all in shadow. From the cropped image that I have here, that whole piece is in shadow. And because it's more of a distant version of what I put on the shadowed red rock spire, it's basically like a grayed down version of those red rock colors that I mixed. So, I'm pushing more of the violet because of that atmospheric effect and because I want it to be further in the distance. But still keeping some warmth in there because it's not as far back as that really distant cliff. So it's like a light violet with a little bit more of that cadmium yellow medium. And basically taking my darkest shade of that and mixing a little blue into it to create those dark pieces of vegetation that are on the cliffs. And so you can see all 3 tiers of these sandstone cliffs. And that's really important because this is basically all the information I need for capturing the effective light that I'm seeing right now on these rocks. So all those pieces where I haven't filled in the red rocks are basically going to be midtones and highlights. And right now I'm focused on just filling in the canvas. Sometimes, my block in is very straightforward. And so what happens is I end up, not repainting a lot of it and not refining enough of it. So my goal kind of for today is to get the whole thing painted with a pretty accurate block in. I'm putting the paint down a little thicker than normal, so it's not quite alla prima and not quite an underpainting. And that's a little tricky because if I don't come back in and reiterate these values, they can end up getting a little flat. So we can't treat any part of the painting process as precious. I feel like that's the majority of when I make mistakes, is when I'm afraid to rework something or, that sort of idea. So really I'm just kind of filling, like paint by numbers, filling in these areas where I see red rock, middle values, and highlights. And so taking that exact same formula that I showed you just a couple minutes ago with the Alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and cad yellow medium. And I've got more cad yellow medium in some of the mixtures, and then I've pulled off in a different direction and added more red because you can kind of see where the sandstone becomes more of a reddish color and where it gets more of that like sunlight hitting it, or kind of the actual sandstone changes a bit, the layers. Now I'm just kind of editing those contours of the rock a little. It almost has this like curved shape around the base of the rock that leads you into a different diagonal, which I think kind of creates a nice sense of tension or balance in the scene. So I like having, those varieties of lines. And I'm going to take this green that I've mixed, this distant green, and start filling in around the red rocks. And once I get that in, and then I get the foreground in, I'll be able to gauge if it needs to be lighter or bluer. But what I care about right now is that this green is darker than the sandstone in light, but lighter than what's going to appear on the foreground hillside. And as I go back further, I try to add a little more blue and white so that I can get that atmospheric quality in there. Kind of adding that little piece of shadowed vegetation at the base of that cliff in the back there. I like these little pops of orange that are coming through. That kind of helps me to gauge the values a little bit as well and see, you know, that some of the sandstone could be even lighter. You kind of get to a point where you feel like you can't mix any more white into a mixture, but you feel like it should still be lighter. So the important thing is to just get all of the paint down, like cover the canvas, and then you can go back and gauge your values. But it's really important that you do go back and gauge your values, because that is a weakness that I've kind of discovered that I have. You know, we can get into refining throughout the whole painting process, and you know, maybe we refined everything so that it's the same value, and then it ends up looking super flat when you bring it inside. So you want to remember to exaggerate all of your values and really make sure that you have a clear mass of light, dark, and middle throughout the painting. So for the sky here, this is going to be my lightest value. Definitely actually more, yeah, it's going to be in the light body. The clouds are going to kind of be at the same value, and then there are some pretty strong highlights on the lower red rocks as well. So for my sky color, I've basically mixed ultramarine blue and white. I actually dipped my brush into that middle value of red rock and kind of mixed it into the ultramarine blue and white combination. So I have some of that land color coming into the sky to further unify it. The sky is still reading as blue, so that is harmonizing with the background and helping out with that atmospheric effect for sure. Something that I've noticed lately in some paintings that I really love, Monet in particular, is just how, you know, the clouds are like orange. And I think that's so cool because, you know, orange and blue are complements, and that creates a really beautiful vibration in the sky. So I'm kind of playing with that. It's a very, very light orange, so you might not even really be able to tell, and I could push that further here. But it also helps to keep that sky in the distance and creates an interesting visual. And I like how the clouds are radiating out from these cliffs here, and this spire in particular. The clouds in the sky are absolutely a part of the composition. So you kind of want everything pointing to what your focus is. And for this painting, I believe that the focus is that, like that morning glory spire right there. So now I'm just adding a little bit of light to the cliffs in the background there, which I don't think was really that necessary. And I might even go back in with a brush and just make that like a clean violet shape again. Might be adding too much. When you talk about, or when you think about focus, you kind of want everything around the focus to be a little bit less refined, and then the focus piece to be the element that's the most refined. That's what draws your eye to it more as well. So having those highlights on the cliffs in retrospect might be a little bit overkill, or, you know, even just doing a disservice to the painting as a whole. So this is another great thing about these videos. I get to kind of watch and see all the little mistakes that I make along the way, which are many in the process of painting. But if we review them, then we can do it differently next time, which is how my practice has evolved over the years. I'm really briefly going into the foreground here. These darks of the trees are going to be my darkest areas of the whole painting. And then I've got definitely a warmer red rock in that foreground hill here. So I've added a little bit more of the cad yellow medium. And as I continue refining, I'll start to pull from some other colors to really push temperature. And I'm going to show you how I mix the green with the same other color idea. I'm taking the ultramarine blue, cad, lemon yellow dominant with just a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. And you can see how much more saturated this green is with more yellow and blue dominant. So another good rule of thumb is that things that are closer towards you are more saturated, and as they recede, they become more grayish. So you're pushing it back by pushing these trees forward, and that gives it a great sense of depth. Even though, these background spires are the focus, it really helps to communicate the space around it. You can see that I'm mixing that hillside that's closer to, again, more of a saturated red rock color, so not as much ultramarine blue, and more of the alizarin crimson and cadmium yellow medium. Just showing you really quick the sky color, ultramarine blue and titanium white as a base, really making sure that it's light. The sky can be either the lightest value or more of a middle value for this time of day, but I am choosing to make it lighter and having the cliffs be more in that middle value range. This is actually my mixture for those distant cliffs, which is the blue and violet, or the blue and alizarin crimson. Just a touch of cad yellow medium. And that you can, from the palette that I've mixed now, you can see how all of the colors have those three colors in them and how it's super unified. And this color that I'm mixing is literally between the sky and the foreground sandstone. And this is those kind of orangey clouds that I was talking about. And so I've mixed it right in between those two with more white added to it. And, that helps to show how the sky is reflecting the ground and the ground is reflecting the sky. So finishing up here now, the one thing that I will say is that those background cliffs could have been definitely a darker value. But I chose to kind of drop that sky color into them because I was wanting them to recede more from the Morning Glory Spire. So the Morning Glory Spire there has the most contrast, and therefore I feel like that's where your eye goes and wants to rest. And that was kind of my intention for the piece. But in terms of making a really strong value arrangement, I think maybe next time I will try to make those kind of in give that a similar dark and see what happens. If I can still maintain the focus, but have a clearer group of values going on throughout. You really want to avoid having too much of the painting reading as very close values, because that takes away the level of impact when you bring it inside. I know things look very different when you're painting outside, and it's important to exaggerate the lights and the darks. So that has been my biggest goal in plein air painting lately, is to really try to get those values on location and not have to fix them up when I get back inside the studio. And I've opened this foreground up a little bit more. Can actually see a repetitive shape there. So another thing to fix maybe. But yeah, that will be hard to fill in with a few more foreground trees. Oh, looks like I've already discovered that, and dropping in this little juniper there. So yeah, this is totally refining, is just checking the work, checking the work. You're looking for values, you're looking for design choices, color choices, and it's almost like you can't just remember them one time. Every stage of the painting, you need to recheck those basic elements and say, is my composition working? Are my values working? All while maintaining that inspiration that you felt when you first came up to the scene and your heart just expanded and you felt like there was something here to share with someone else. So how do we kind of merge this need to communicate the landscape through technique, and also this, the true desire is to communicate what you felt when you were there. So how can you lead people into this beautiful space that you were in? And, a lot of that comes through just refining and having your mental state kind of in two places at once, in the tangible world and the intangible world. And it's a beautiful dance. Don't get too hard on yourself if one sometimes overrides the other, and just trying to maintain that balance while you're painting. And yeah, I'm still kind of making a few refining touches here. I think ultimately I do want to add a couple small highlights on that background cliff, just a little bit, so that it's, it aids in the design. It's kind of this another arrow, as I like to call it, to the focus. Love that little bit of light that's coming in on the rocks, and that's going to be kind of a middle value light. I don't want it to be as light as the sky, but I want it to pop out from the shadow. And it's got a little more like of a red-yellow mixture. And then the last thing I'm looking at here is maybe some of those spots where the wash is showing through. I do like them, but I don't want it to, detract either. So I think what I'll do is just go in and maybe add a couple of pieces of reflected sky over them, and a little bit more of that red rock, just ever so slightly. Maybe leaving a couple in there still, because they kind of create this warm sparkle effect. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.